April 22, 2010. Bret Michaels, the voice of Poison, collapsed in a hotel room at the very moment his career was experiencing a resurgence. The headache was so excruciating that he couldn't speak, couldn't stand, and only hours later doctors delivered the verdict. A brain hemorrhage. A 15% chance of survival. For many, that should have been the end. For Bret Michaels, it became the moment that exposed an entire life the public had never truly seen. Before lying motionless in an ICU bed, Bret was the embodiment of 1980s glam metal, the man under the stage lights leading Poison to conquer the Billboard charts with Every Rose Has Its Thorn, Talk Dirty to Me, Nothing But a Good Time. He was the face of a dazzling, deafening era, soaked in glory and excess. Yet behind the image of an indestructible rocker was a body perpetually on the brink of collapse. From the age of 6, Bret lived with type 1 diabetes. Decades of performing while carrying needles, insulin, and the constant risk of passing out followed him everywhere. He nearly died in a car accident, became entangled in scandals, lost his band, lost an era, and finally faced death head-on when his brain began to hemorrhage. So what keeps someone standing on stage for more than 200 nights a year when his own body keeps betraying him? What allowed Bret Michaels to survive amid fame, tragedy, and moments that seemed impossible to come back from? His life is not the story of a lucky rock star. It is a brutal survival journey of a man who was never allowed the luxury of being weak. To understand why Bret Michaels was able to survive that moment, you have to go much further back, to a time when he was never allowed to live like a normal child. Bret Michaels was born on March 15, 1963, in Butler, Pennsylvania. His birth name is Bret Michaels Sycak. He grew up in a typical American working-class family, where life revolved around discipline, responsibility, and early self-reliance. His father, Wally Sycak, worked in construction and mechanical trades. His mother, Marjorie Sycak, was a devoted homemaker who kept the household running with firm structure and order. No one in the family was a professional artist. There was no musical bloodline, no stage stories passed down to inspire the next generation. Bret was the only son, raised alongside 2 sisters in a home where care was shown more through actions than words. The family wasn't wealthy, but it was stable. Not loud, but orderly. At first, Bret's childhood was relatively ordinary. Local schools, neighborhood playgrounds, quiet afternoons spent around the house, until his body began sending alarming signals. When Bret was 6 years old, he became persistently exhausted, lost weight rapidly, experienced uncontrollable thirst, and nearly fainted multiple times. His family rushed him to the hospital in critical condition, and the diagnosis came quickly and decisively: type 1 diabetes. There was no curative treatment, no phase where the illness would go away, only a lifelong reality. Bret's body could not produce insulin, and every single day of survival would depend on injections, blood sugar monitoring, and the constant risk of death if a mistake was made. From that moment on, Bret's childhood was split in 2. One half tried to blend into the world of other children, school, playgrounds, laughter. The other half was governed by harsh rules no child should have to carry. Food measured in grams, rigid schedules that couldn't slip, physical activity that had to be carefully controlled, and the ever-present fear of hypoglycemia lurking beneath everything. Bret learned very early how to inject himself, how to monitor his own body, and more importantly, how to suffer in silence, because no one around him truly understood what it felt like to live in a body that could betray him at any moment. It was within that isolation that Bret began turning to music, not as a dream of fame, but as a refuge. A guitar and a harmonica never asked if he was healthy, never demanded explanations about his illness, never forced him to slow down. When he played music, Bret was no longer the sick kid. He was someone in control of rhythm, sound, and, at least for that moment, control over himself. Music gradually became Bret's way of pushing back against a life that seemed decided far too early. Not to escape reality, but to assert that even with a flawed body, his voice could still rise, loud, clear, and impossible to ignore. For Bret Michaels, music was never a harmless pastime. It entered his life at the exact moment his body was being forced into relentless discipline, and it gradually became the only place where he was allowed to breathe on his own rhythm. As he entered his teenage years, Bret wasn't searching for big stages or dreams of fame. He was searching for a sense of control, and music gave him that. In the early 1980s, Bret began playing regularly with Ricky Rocket at bars around Pittsburgh. These were not glamorous venues, but loud, smoke-filled rooms where audiences only paid attention if a band was loud enough, reckless enough, and stubborn enough to play through the heckling. Bret learned how to sing over chaos, how to hold a stage with energy and presence rather than flashy technique. Alongside bassist Bobby Dahl and guitarist Matt Smith, they formed a band called Paris, a cautious name that accurately reflected where they stood at the time. People testing themselves, not yet daring to make bold claims. But Bret quickly realized that Pittsburgh was too small for the ambitions growing in his mind. In 1984, he was the one who pushed the decision to abandon everything and head to Los Angeles, where hair metal was beginning to form into a cultural fever. This was not a romantic choice, it was a gamble. They crammed themselves into cheap apartments, and at times even took shelter in damp storage spaces where there were more insects than musical equipment. By day, they worked whatever jobs they could just to survive. By night, they played shows, rehearsed relentlessly, and recorded demos using the cheapest gear they could find. Bret didn't wait to be discovered. He personally carried their tapes door to door to small record labels, teaching himself how to talk about the band as if it were something impossible to ignore. The strain of that process began to expose internal differences. Matt Smith left the group, creating a void not only in guitar technique, but in direction. And when C.C. DeVille appeared, everything immediately changed color. DeVille's wild, flamboyant, sexually charged guitar style collided head-on with Bret's instinctive need to control everything through survival-driven discipline. Rather than smoothing over the clash, Bret chose to harness it. The band renamed itself Poison, a name that was no longer neutral, reflecting exactly the energy they were generating: addictive, dangerous, and unsuitable for anyone who wanted to remain on the sidelines. From that moment on, Bret Michaels was no longer just a singer trying to find his footing. He became the center of a machine taking shape, one in which tension, conflict, and ambition were all pushed to their limits, enough either to explode or to self-destruct. The name Poison, after cramped club nights and demo tapes returned with rejection stamps, finally reached the one thing Bret Michaels had been waiting for: a crack wide enough to charge straight into the light. In 1986, when their debut album Look What the Cat Dragged In was released through Enigma Records, almost no one in the industry treated it as a serious bet. The sound was dismissed as too glossy, the image too excessive, and the four big-haired young men were written off as a disposable byproduct of a trend about to burn itself out. But Bret understood something many overlooked. Poison didn't need critical approval. They needed an audience. MTV did the rest. When Talk Dirty to Me began airing constantly on television screens across America, Poison was no longer a club band. The song wasn't complex or philosophical, but it hit the sense of release American youth in the late 1980s were craving. The album quickly shattered initial expectations, went multi-platinum, and Poison transformed from an underestimation into a phenomenon. At the center of that storm stood Bret Michaels. Not just the voice at the microphone, but the writer of nearly all the lyrics, the one who set the band's emotional tone, and the face most frequently framed by the media's cameras. 2 years later, Open Up and Say, pushed Poison from phenomenon to icon. Nothin But a Good Time became the soundtrack to endless party nights. Fallen Angel brushed against the darker side of the Hollywood dream Bret himself was living inside. And then, Every Rose. Has Its Thorn arrived. A ballad that wasn't loud, didn't flex muscle, yet climbed straight to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. With that song, Bret revealed a vulnerable side the glam metal image usually concealed, and the public realized Poison didn't just know how to cause chaos, they knew how to touch emotion. From 1986 on, Poison blanketed radio, MTV, stadiums, and magazine covers. They embodied an America intoxicated with freedom, indulgence, and the belief that every dream could be sung out loud. And Bret Michaels, amid the cheers and spotlights, both enjoyed that peak and quietly carried the pressure of the timekeeper, the one who had to turn chaos into songs and spectacle into something that could last longer than a single fashion cycle. Before the excitement of Open Up and Say, had even cooled, Bret Michaels pushed Poison one step further. Not louder, but deeper. Flesh and Blood, released in 1990, emerged as the natural response of a band that had just touched the summit. Less boasting, less glitter, more layers of reflection. Unskinny Bop kept the party pulse alive. Ride the Wind drove speed and ambition into dangerous territory. But Something to Believe In became the album's spiritual center, where Bret exposed a need to believe in something beyond lights, money, and the endless repetition of applause. That music mirrored his own condition. A leader struggling to keep balance between a success machine running without rest and a body and mind worn down night after night. In 4 years, 3 consecutive multi-platinum albums was a rare feat. Poison stepped out as headliners of massive tours. Videos saturated MTV, and schedules stacked with no pause in sight. Bret was the lyricist, the public face, and the one who had to pull everything back into alignment whenever the machinery began to wobble. And wobble it did. Egos swelled with fame, creative differences started colliding, and relentless schedules devoured recovery time. The indulgent lifestyle, once considered the seasoning of glam metal, became a simmering burden, pushing heart rate and emotions to the brink. On stage, Bret still burned bright. Backstage, tension accumulated like strings stretched too tight. Flesh and Blood, therefore, carried an unusual tone, both triumphant and cautionary, both a battle cry and a quiet self-question about the price of standing on the peak when the ground keeps drifting farther away. The string that had been stretched tight through years of conquest finally snapped in 1991, in a moment when all the stage lights went dark behind them. Just minutes after Poison appeared at the MTV Video Music Awards, Bret Michaels and CC DeVille lunged at each other in a fight that could no longer be hidden. It wasn't a sudden outburst of anger. It was the result of years of exhaustion, inflated egos, sleepless nights, and the feeling of being pushed to the edge within their own band. The decision to fire CC came swiftly and coldly, and at the same time, a piece of Poison's musical soul was torn from its body. When Richie Kotzen joined and Native Tongue was released in 1993, it looked like an attempt at rebirth. The guitar work was sharper, the song structures more mature, and Bret tried to adjust his tone to fit a version of Poison that was less flamboyant. But what had once made them explode, boldness, excess, the unapologetic party spirit, was no longer the public's shared language. The album earned respect for musicianship, but lacked the raw, instinctive pull that had once fueled miracles. Then another fracture appeared, this time where private life overlapped with the collective. Kotzen was discovered to be involved with Ricky Rocket's girlfriend. No lengthy explanations were needed. He was removed from the lineup, and Poison severed yet another artery. Outside, the world had changed tempo. Grunge and alternative surged like a cold wave, carrying darkness, simplicity, and rebellion against everything glam metal represented. Bands that had once dominated MTV were labeled outdated within a few broadcast seasons. Bret stood at the most difficult crossroads of his career: cling to the identity that had taken him to the top, or accept that the spotlight was fading in the eyes of a new generation. In that silence, the cracks were no longer confined to music. They spread into belief, into how an artist sees his own future when the past still echoes too loudly. That decline didn't stop at tense meetings or magazine covers turning away. It slammed straight into Bret Michaels' life with a real, brutal impact. In May 1994, on a dark road in Arizona, after a long night of drinking, Bret got behind the wheel of his new Ferrari. High speed, dulled reflexes from alcohol, and a momentary loss of control. The car crashed head-on into a utility pole with enough force to nearly fold the vehicle in half. The impact threw him out of position, his head smashing violently into the windshield. When he was pulled from the wreckage, Bret had a broken nose, a shattered jaw, multiple missing teeth, fractured ribs, and his body was in traumatic shock, separated from death by only a razor-thin margin. That accident didn't just tear apart flesh and bone. It exposed a truth Bret had avoided for years. This body could no longer endure the pace of life he was forcing upon it. But even as he was still piecing himself back together, the next blow was already waiting. Poison returned to the studio hoping to salvage one last chance, and what they received was a refusal from their label. Instead of a new album, the market was given a greatest hits compilation, a quiet full stop placed at the end of an era. The unreleased recordings were left hanging until 2000, when they finally emerged under the title Crack a Smile and More, by which time mainstream musical taste had completely shifted and glam metal had been pushed into the realm of nostalgia. Amid all that, another bomb detonated, not from music, but from a private life dragged into public view. A personal videotape involving Bret and Pamela Anderson was leaked and ended up in the hands of Internet Entertainment Group. Lawsuits followed, but the image Bret had spent nearly a decade building was shredded across tabloids, talk shows, and mocking headlines. As grunge, alternative, and then nu metal rose, Poison was boxed in as the symbol of a bygone era. Hollyweird was released in an effort to fight back, tours continued, but the central position on MTV and the charts was gone. Bret, his diabetes growing more severe, his accident injuries not fully healed, still stood on stage, not to prove anything to the world, but as a way of holding himself together. After the 1994 crash and the series of blows that followed, from both the market and the media, Poison continued to cling to music, even as their trajectory drifted away from the center. Crack a Smile and More had been recorded earlier but wasn't released until 2000, like a forgotten fragment of an era that had just closed. 2 years later, Hollyweird arrived in a landscape where MTV had changed its programming, radio had shifted its taste, and the name Poison no longer occupied the heart of popular culture. The album still carried familiar energy, still represented an effort to reinvent, but the world's attention had moved elsewhere. The stages were still lit, the tours still went on, only now they no longer sat at the center of the musical map. And Bret Michaels understood one thing clearly. If he stood still waiting for the old wheel to turn again, it would crush him along with it. He chose to branch off. In the late 1990s, Bret founded a production company and pushed himself into a new role, that of a visual storyteller. Letter from Death Row, 1998, was a risky gamble. He didn't just star in it, but also wrote the script, took part in directing, and personally composed the soundtrack. The film didn't turn Bret into a movie star, but it revealed a familiar survival instinct. He refused to disappear simply because the rock spotlight no longer shone directly on him. His solo music also opened a different space for him to breathe. Songs of Life, 2003, carried a more confessional tone, less showy than his glam metal years. Freedom of Sound, 2005, veered fully into country, a move that confused many longtime fans, but reflected his need for honesty and simplicity after years of living at maximum speed. Bret wasn't chasing trends. He was trying to keep his own heartbeat steady. When music was no longer the only doorway into the public's heart, Bret Michaels chose another path. Risky, controversial, but perfectly aligned with the survival instinct he had carried since childhood. In 2007, Rock of Love appeared on VH1 as a sharp turn. A glam rocker in his 40s placed himself at the center of a chaotic dating show, where personal emotions were exposed as reality TV spectacle. Critics turned away, dismissing it as loud and overexposed. The general audience did the opposite. They watched, and they stayed. Bret understood that rhythm well. Instead of hiding his scars, he brought them into the light, turning vulnerability, loneliness, and the need to be understood into drama with tempo and climax. 3 seasons of Rock of Love, 2007 to 2009, didn't result in a lasting relationship, but they delivered something more important: presence. Bret was no longer just a name living in MTV nostalgia. He stepped directly into the living rooms of millions of American households. Life as I Know It, 2010, continued that narrative, exposing a life layered between stage, illness, and responsibility, without sugarcoating, without shielding. That same year, The Celebrity Apprentice placed him in another arena where resilience, discipline, and the ability to connect were measured by concrete results. Bret won the season and raised the highest amount of charity funds, all while his body was still recovering from life-threatening blows. A quiet assertion that he still held control over his own rhythm. Then came April 22nd, 2010. While filming The Celebrity Apprentice and preparing for an upcoming concert, Bret Michaels felt a sharp pain shoot from the back of his neck to the top of his head. He described it as a small handgun going off inside my skull. Within minutes, the glam metal legend, who had survived a car crash, scandals, and a lifetime of illness, collapsed to the floor, unable to speak, unable to stand. He was rushed to the emergency room in critical condition. Doctors quickly determined the cause: a subarachnoid brain hemorrhage, one of the most dangerous neurological emergencies, often fatal within 24 hours without immediate intervention. Upon admission, Bret's chance of survival was estimated at just 15%. In the cold ICU, where machines emitted steady beeps matching his weakened heartbeat, there were no guitars, no audience, no stage makeup. There was only a 47-year-old man lying motionless, blood slowly leaking in his brain, and a heart still fighting because 2 young daughters were waiting for news outside. Just as the medical team began to see a faint light of recovery, a second crisis struck. Bret suffered a mild stroke after doctors discovered a hole in his heart, a congenital defect that had never been diagnosed. The doctors were stunned. He was bleeding in the brain, and at the same time could suffer a fatal blockage at any moment if blood crossed into the weakened part of his heart. This was no longer simply a medical emergency. It was a direct duel with death. Time seemed to freeze for 48 hours. No one could be sure he would make it. But Bret, a man who had injected insulin into himself since the age of 6, who had crawled out of twisted wreckage after a car crash, who had sung through concerts while his blood sugar dropped, once again refused to fall. He survived, against all odds. 3 days in a coma, 9 days in the ICU. His first steps after waking were like those of a child learning to walk again, shaky, painful, slow. His speech was slurred, his memory fragmented. Things most people never think twice about became, for Bret, victories of life itself. And after everything, what earned the deepest respect wasn't that he survived, but how he returned. No retirement announcement, no self-pity, no using the accident as an excuse to retreat. Just months later, Michaels was back on stage. The same guitar, the same voice. But this time, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been so visible before. Gratitude. After all the adversity I've been through, I just feel grateful to be here. If I were to go today, and I hope I don't, I would die with a full heart. Later that year, Custom Built was released. There Bret returned with mainstream energy, collaborating with Miley Cyrus on Nothing to Lose as a cross-generational handshake that placed him back in the present without pretending to be younger. True Grit, 2015, continued to affirm a sustainable path. No chart chasing, a focus on emotion and live performance. Alongside that personal journey, Poison gradually found a form of existence better suited to the times. CeCe DeVille returned to the lineup, old conflicts set aside to make room for shared memory. Nostalgia tours no longer needed MTV dominance to sell tickets. Live revenue remained steady. Audiences came not to find the newest thing, but to reconnect with a piece of their own lives. And Bret Michaels stood at the center of those nights in a different role. No longer a chart conqueror, but a keeper of a living memory, fully aware of where he stood and why he was still standing there. During that very period, when Bret Michaels' image was still wavering between the afterglow of fame and a series of hard collisions with reality, a relationship ignited that was faster, more volatile, and more consequential than any love song he had ever written. Around 1993, Bret met Pamela Anderson, just as she was rising into a new sex symbol of Hollywood, while he still carried the aura of a glam-metal rock star, not yet fully displaced from his own golden era. They were drawn to each other almost instantly, both famous, both trapped inside the media machine, both accustomed to being watched far more than truly understood. The relationship was brief, but intensely charged. Bret was standing in the middle of professional and physical crisis. Pamela was living under the growing pressure of a public image being relentlessly exploited. They were together, appeared together, and even considered a long-term future. But they were never married. There was no wedding, no children, only months of compressed emotion lived inside a space where personal boundaries barely existed. After the breakup, what seemed like a closed chapter reopened in the most brutal way possible. A private videotape, something Bret believed existed only within a personal sphere, was stolen and ended up in the hands of Internet Entertainment Group, the same company involved in distributing Pamela's other infamous tape. Bret entered a legal battle to block its release. Insisting he had never consented, never profited, and had spent a significant amount of money simply to keep something private that should never have been public. The incident didn't just expose an intimate corner of his life, it deepened a sense of betrayal and loss of control at precisely the moment he was trying to piece himself back together after the car crash and Poison's decline. The media did not stand with him. The image of a man once seen as a symbol of carefree excess was twisted into tabloid mockery. For Bret, this was not merely a scandal, it was a direct strike at trust itself, blurring the line between love and damage more than ever before. His relationship with Pamela, therefore, did not leave behind a family or a peaceful chapter. It left a deep scar. The scar of placing trust in a world where anything can be taken, copied, and displayed before a crowd overnight. From the aftershocks of that relationship, Bret Michaels entered another phase of his emotional life, quieter, longer-lasting, and no less painful. Around the mid-1990s, when Poison had fallen from the spotlight and Bret was struggling to rebuild both his career and his body after the accident, he met Christy Gibson. Not a star, not someone living under flashing lights. Christy appeared at a moment when Bret needed a human being rather than an icon. This relationship did not explode publicly the way the previous one had. It unfolded in relative silence, stretching across years of career fractures, less glamorous tours, repeated hospitalizations from diabetic complications, and sheer exhaustion. Christy stayed, not as a red carpet figure, but within everyday life, waiting, adapting, enduring a man who was constantly forced to divide his body between the stage, the hospital, and unresolved ghosts from the past. 2 daughters were born, Rain Elizabeth in 2000 and Jorge Blue in 2005, marking the first time Bret Michaels had to learn how to exist not only for himself. Fatherhood forced him to confront things rock and roll never taught: presence, responsibility, and a fear of loss that was no longer abstract. In those years, Bret toured while monitoring blood sugar, recorded music while taking his children to school, tried to maintain the image of an unbreakable artist while learning to become a pillar he himself had never had growing up. In 2010, after Bret miraculously survived a brain hemorrhage and stroke, he became engaged to Christy. That moment carried more weight than a romantic promise. It was the reflex of a man who had just stared at the line between life and death and feared losing what remained. Christy had been at his hospital bedside, and along with their 2 young daughters, during the days when Bret wasn't sure he would ever stand again. The engagement did not open the door to a wedding. It opened another trial, because physical recovery did not mean healing the fractures that had accumulated over nearly 2 decades. By 2012, Bret and Christy separated. There was no wedding to undo, no divorce proceedings, only the quiet ending of a relationship that had lasted more than 16 years, closing under the weight of 2 people who had walked together through too many crises. Bret later admitted that he was not an easy man to live with. A body perpetually in alarm, a mind that never fully left the stage, and an obsession with the idea that anyone who came too close could be taken away by life at any moment. Christy Gibson did not exit the story as a scandal or a fallen symbol. She left behind something deeper, the period in which Bret Michaels lived closest to a real family, where music was not always the center, where 2 daughters became the reason he continued fighting illness, and where the limits of a rock star were forced into their clearest view. And in the present day, Bret Michaels does not live in a state of nostalgia, nor is he waiting for a spectacular comeback. He maintains a steady, disciplined, and far more grounded rhythm of life than the untamed rock star image of the 1980s to 90s would suggest. In recent years, Bret has continued to appear regularly on stage with Poison in large-scale nostalgia tours, where audiences don't come looking for something new, but to reconnect with their own youth. He remains the central figure of those nights, not because of symbolic dominance, but because of the rare endurance of someone who has passed through nearly every vortex of the entertainment industry without disappearing. Alongside performing, Bret continues to manage his personal ventures, from solo music and branding to business projects tied to the idea of rock and resilience. Health issues have forced him to slow down and live with far more control, but they have not pushed him out of public life. Instead, Bret chooses his appearances carefully, speaking about diabetes, recovery from trauma, and the experience of survival. not as motivational slogans, but as the lived reality of someone who has repeatedly stood at the edge between life and death. Bret Michaels' legacy does not reside solely in multi-platinum records or Billboard-topping hits. It lies in the way he represents a glam metal generation that pop history once dismissed as outdated, yet still found a new place without denying its past. Bret did not redefine himself by chasing trends, but through adaptation, from MTV to reality television, from arena stages to nostalgia tours, from the image of a conqueror to the role of a survivor. For many listeners, Bret Michaels is no longer the symbol of a glitter-soaked era. He is proof that an artist can lose the peak, watch fame erode, suffer physical damage, and still preserve the core instinct to stand back up and keep moving. That quiet but stubborn persistence is the most irreplaceable legacy he leaves behind. Bret Michaels is not a polished role model meant to be admired from a distance. He exists as a human being who has endured enough collisions to understand the value of simply remaining upright. What remains after that journey is not old glory or chart positions, but something far more real: the courage to live, to pay the price, and to continue even when nothing is on your side. The wounds in his life are not hidden or turned into hollow myth. They are carried onto the stage, into his voice, and into the way he appears before the public, calm, grateful, and asking no one for pity. For Bret, music is not a tool to prove relevance. It is the breath that allows him to survive. As long as there is a stage, a microphone, and someone willing to listen, he will sing. Not to return to the past, but to affirm that in the present, he is still alive, still feeling, still capable of connecting with another human being. That persistence lifts Bret's story beyond the boundaries of a rocker or a television personality, turning it into a mirror for anyone who has fallen, doubted themselves, or had to stand back up in silence. If Poison's music once helped you through a difficult period, if the image of that bandana once made you feel stronger when life was unsteady, share your story in the comments below. Hit like if this story gave you something worth holding on to. Share the video to spread that energy of survival. And subscribe to the channel to continue walking alongside real human journeys like this one. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next story.